Evelyn traced the same familiar path through the aisles of the neighborhood grocery store, her cart rattling slightly as she navigated around displays of seasonal produce and half-empty shelves. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting a cold, steady glow over everything. It was a scene she had walked through countless times, so predictable she could almost do it blindfolded. At 52, her life had fallen into a rhythm that felt less like stability and more like stagnation. Widowed for nearly a decade, and with her grown children scattered across different cities, her days were mostly solitary. Mornings were spent tending to her small garden, afternoons reading or running errands, and evenings flipping through old photo albums or watching reruns of shows she no longer found funny. Her world had shrunk to the size of her modest home and this grocery store. Yet, despite the ache of loneliness that sometimes crept in, she told herself she was content. She had learned to appreciate quiet moments, even if they weren't shared with anyone. It was during one of these uneventful afternoons, as she compared the prices of 2 brands of coffee, that she first noticed him. He was crouched near the bottom shelf, his dark curls tumbling forward as he scanned the labels on an assortment of spices. There was an easy, unhurried energy about him, something Evelyn envied. He didn't have the hurried impatience of most shoppers. Instead, he seemed to take his time, as if even mundane tasks deserved care. She didn't realize she was staring until he glanced up, catching her off guard. His eyes were warm and curious, framed by a slight smile that seemed to say, "I caught you." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said quickly, clutching her card as if it might shield her from her embarrassment. "I didn't mean to." "No need to apologize," he interrupted, his tone light and reassuring. "I get it. These spices are ridiculously overpriced." Evelyn chuckled despite herself, the tension breaking as easily as a twig underfoot. "I was actually comparing coffee brands, but you might have a point." For a moment, their conversation lingered on the absurdity of grocery store pricing, the kind of harmless small talk she hadn't indulged in for years. She learned his name was Alex, and he was in his early 30s, recently relocated to the area for work. He was charming but not in a deliberate way. There was no air of pretense about him, just an openness that made her feel seen. It wasn't until much later that evening, as she set the new coffee bag on her counter, that she realized how unusual it was for her to feel that way. Seen. For years, Evelyn had moved through life like an invisible thread in a worn-out tapestry, present, but unremarkable. That brief exchange with Alex had felt like a spark, illuminating her world in a way she hadn't realized she needed. As she sipped her coffee the next morning, she found herself hoping she'd see him again, even though she told herself it was silly. Surely, it had been nothing more than a passing moment, a rare but fleeting connection. But the thought of him lingered, and for the first time in years, she found herself looking forward to her next trip to the store the next time Evelyn saw Alex. It was as if fate had conspired to align their paths. She was in the produce section, carefully selecting tomatoes, when his familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "Still comparing prices," he teased lightly, and when she looked up, there he was, holding a basket with a carton of eggs and a bunch of bananas. Evelyn couldn't help but smile. Always. Old habits die hard. From there, their conversation flowed easily, just as it had before. They talked about recipes, his recent attempt at a disastrous curry, her tried-and-true pot roast, and laughed over shared stories of kitchen mishaps. Before she knew it, they were walking through the aisles together, his casual humor drawing out laughter she hadn't felt in years. At the checkout, Alex surprised her by asking, "Do you live nearby? There's a farmer's market opening this weekend downtown. I think you'd love it." Evelyn hesitated. It wasn't every day that a younger man casually invited her somewhere. But his tone was friendly, without a hint of pretense, and she found herself saying, "I do, actually." "That sounds lovely." The market became their shared meeting ground. They wandered through the stalls, sampling fresh bread and admiring colorful bouquets of flowers. He bought her a small bunch of lavender to brighten her kitchen, and she, feeling bold, bought them both hot apple cider from a stand. Over time, these casual meetings became a pattern. A chance encounter at the grocery store turned into a standing joke between them, and soon, their conversation spilled beyond food. Alex told her about his job at a local nonprofit, his love for hiking, and how he missed his dog, who was staying with his parents until he settled in fully. Evelyn found herself opening up too, sharing stories about her late husband, her children, and the solitude that had come to define her days. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed someone to listen until Alex did so without judgment or pity. "You're really easy to talk to," he said one afternoon as they sat on a park bench sipping iced coffee. Evelyn laughed softly. "That's a skill you develop when you spend a lot of time alone. You think more carefully about your words." "Well," Alex replied, "I think you should talk more often. You have a lot worth saying." His words lingered with her long after they parted ways. She began to notice how much lighter she felt after their conversations, how the days didn't seem quite as monotonous anymore. It wasn't just his humor or his kindness. It was the way he seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, as if her age or her quiet life didn't matter. One evening, as Evelyn prepared dinner, she realized she was humming, a habit she hadn't indulged in for years. It struck her how much Alex had changed the rhythm of her days. What had once been predictable and dull now held a sense of anticipation. Evelyn couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so alive. It was during one of their now frequent outings that Evelyn felt the first shift, an unexpected flutter that left her both exhilarated and unnerved. They were seated at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of town, a discovery Alex had made on one of his long walks. It was cozy and unassuming, with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air. Evelyn had been recounting a memory from her childhood, a light-hearted story about her brothers and a mischievous attempt to build a treehouse. Alex listened intently, his chin resting on his hand, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "You must have been fearless as a kid," he said, laughing when she described climbing the tree despite her father's stern warnings. "I think I lost some of that along the way," she replied with a wistful smile. Alex tilted his head, his expression softening. "I don't believe that. You've got more spirit than most people I know." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, she couldn't look away from him. The way he saw her, truly saw her, made her chest tighten. She hadn't felt this way in decades, not since her late husband had looked at her with the same unspoken admiration. That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn replayed the conversation in her mind. It was innocent enough, but something about the way Alex had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her, stirred feelings she hadn't expected. She tried to dismiss it as a fleeting moment, a misplaced sentiment. After all, he was younger, so much younger. Surely she was imagining things. But the more she thought about him, the more she realized it wasn't just that moment in the cafe. It was the way he remembered the small details of her stories, the way his laughter felt like sunlight breaking through a cloudy day. It was the way he made her feel alive again, not as an invisible woman in her 50s, but as someone worth noticing. The realization came with a rush of emotions, surprise, longing, and an undeniable wave of fear. What did this mean? How could she feel this way about a man so much younger? Evelyn spent the next few days in a state of quiet turmoil, replaying every interaction they'd had. She tried to convince herself it was nothing more than a passing infatuation, a silly reaction to the kindness and attention she had been missing for so long. But as much as she tried to rationalize it, the feelings persisted. Every time she saw him, her heart quickened, her smile lingered longer, and her laughter felt more genuine. One evening, as she stood by her kitchen window, watching the last light of day fade into twilight, she allowed herself to whisper the truth she had been avoiding. "I think I've fallen for him." The words hung in the air, both terrifying and liberating. For the first time, Evelyn acknowledged the depth of her feelings. But with that acknowledgement came a flood of doubts. What would people think? What would Alex think? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. Her life, once predictable and unchanging, had been irreversibly altered. Evelyn's days became a labyrinth of conflicting emotions. On one hand, her encounters with Alex were a source of undeniable joy. His texts, simple, thoughtful messages about his day or a funny meme he'd found, brought a brightness to her mornings. Their impromptu coffee dates and long conversations felt like a lifeline to a part of herself she thought had long since faded. But on the other hand, there was the constant whisper of doubt. She caught herself staring too long at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, scrutinizing every fine line and silver strand. She wondered what Alex saw when he looked at her. Could he see past her age, Or was this friendship, this connection, simply a kindness on his part? And what of the world? Evelyn could already imagine the sideways glances and hushed comments if anyone saw them together. Society wasn't forgiving of relationships that defied convention, especially when it came to older women and younger men. These thoughts kept her awake at night, turning over every scenario in her mind. She didn't want to ruin what they had, whatever it was, but her feelings were becoming too strong to ignore. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench sharing a bag of roasted almonds, Alex noticed her quiet mood. "Hey," he said gently, nudging her shoulder. "You've been a little distant today. Everything okay?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her scarf. She wanted to tell him everything, to spill the emotions that had been building inside her like a storm. But the words felt too heavy, too risky. "I've just been thinking a lot," she said finally, keeping her tone light. "You know how it is when your mind runs away with you." Alex nodded, though his brow furrowed slightly. "Well, if you ever feel like talking about it, I'm here. You know that, right?" The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. She nodded quickly, blinking back the sting of tears. Later that evening, Evelyn found herself journaling, something she hadn't done in years. She poured her thoughts onto the page, raw and unfiltered. "Why am I so afraid? Why can't I just enjoy what we have? Because it's not just a friendship anymore, is it?" Admitting it, even on paper, felt like a small act of rebellion. She thought about Alex's kindness, his laughter, the way he made her feel valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. But then she thought about the age difference, the inevitable questions, and the risk of losing him if she misstepped. As the days passed, Evelyn tried to distance herself from the intensity of her emotions. She told herself she could compartmentalize, keep their relationship as it was, a cherished friendship. But the truth was, every moment they spent together only deepened her feelings. And every time he smiled at her or touched her arm in a casual, friendly way, her resolve faltered. She was caught between the thrill of newfound affection and the weight of societal judgment. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt truly, terrifyingly alive. The decision came to Evelyn one quiet evening, almost as if the idea had been waiting patiently for her to embrace it. She had been in the kitchen, preparing her usual solitary dinner, when her gaze fell on the lavender bouquet Alex had given her weeks ago. Though the flowers had dried, they still carried his essence, a reminder of his thoughtfulness and the easy joy he brought to her life. It wasn't just the bouquet, of course. It was the accumulation of all their shared moments, his laughter echoing in her ears, his words of encouragement lingering in her heart. She couldn't deny it any longer. Alex had become more than just a friend to her. But what could she do about it? Was it foolish to risk disrupting the delicate balance of their friendship? The thought of losing him terrified her, but the ache of holding back felt equally unbearable. As she stood there, spoon in hand, Evelyn made a choice. She would invite him over, not for anything extravagant, just a quiet dinner. A chance to deepen their connection in the comfort of her home, away from prying eyes. The next day, while texting Alex about a new cafe she discovered, Evelyn added, almost hesitantly, "By the way, would you like to come over for dinner sometime? I'd love to cook for you." She stared at the screen, her pulse racing as the 3 little dots indicating his reply appeared. "That sounds amazing. I've been curious to see where the master chef works her magic." "When?" She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a smile tugging at her lips. His enthusiasm gave her courage. "Friday night? Around 7. Perfect. I'll bring dessert." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Evelyn couldn't remember the last time she'd cared so much about hosting someone. She pored over recipes, debated over table settings, and even treated herself to a new blouse, a soft blue that she thought complemented her eyes. When Friday finally arrived, her nerves were a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She wanted everything to be perfect, not because she feared judgment, but because this dinner felt like an unspoken declaration. It was her way of saying, "You matter to me." When the doorbell rang at precisely 7, Evelyn took a deep breath before opening the door. Alex stood there, holding a box of pastries and a bottle of wine, his smile as warm as ever. "I hope you're hungry," he said, stepping inside. Evelyn laughed, her nerves easing at his casual demeanor. "I should be saying that to you. Come in." As they moved into the kitchen, Evelyn couldn't help but notice how naturally he fit into her space, how his presence made her home feel less empty. "Something smells amazing," Alex said, peeking at the simmering pot on the stove. "It's just cocoa vin," she replied, feigning nonchalance despite the hours she'd spent perfecting the dish. They settled into an easy rhythm, talking, laughing, and sharing stories as they ate. The dinner stretched on, the conversation flowing effortlessly, and Evelyn found herself forgetting her earlier anxieties. By the time they moved to the living room with their wine and pastries, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a warmth, an intimacy, that hadn't been there before. Evelyn could feel it in the way Alex's gaze lingered on her, in the comfortable silences that spoke volumes. As the evening wound down, Evelyn realized she had taken a step forward, not just with Alex but with herself. She had allowed hope to enter her life again, and for the first time in years, it felt right the air between them was different now. There was no denying it. Evelyn had invited Alex into her home, into the space she had once reserved for solitude and quiet evenings. But tonight it felt different. The room pulsed with something unspoken, something that had been building quietly between them. They sat together on her worn sofa, glasses of wine in hand, the soft hum of music filling the space between words. Evelyn noticed how his hand rested close to hers, a subtle yet intentional gesture that made her heart flutter. His eyes, as always, held an intensity that both comforted and unnerved her. "You know," Alex said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've really enjoyed spending time with you these past few weeks." He took a small sip of wine, his gaze steady. "It's been different. In a good way." Evelyn smiled, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, she felt exactly the same way. There was something about their time together that had transformed her routine into something vivid and alive. But the question that lingered unspoken was whether this connection, this spark, could survive the weight of their age difference. "I'm glad," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I've enjoyed it too. More than I expected." He turned toward her then, his expression more serious, his lips slightly parted as if he were about to say something important. "You've been a big part of my life lately," he said, his voice gentle but deliberate. "I know we've joked about it, but I don't think I've ever met someone like you." He leaned in a little closer, his hand brushing against hers. "There's just something about you, Evelyn." Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively pulled back slightly, as if trying to create some distance between the desire building inside her and the fear that had taken root. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her wineglass. "You're much younger than me," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to keep the conversation light. "This, whatever this is, it doesn't have an easy answer." Alex studied her for a moment, and his eyes softened, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You think I don't know that?" He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face with the tenderness of someone who had already crossed the threshold of deeper feelings. "But it doesn't change how I feel. I'm not asking for anything complicated. I'm just here with you, Evelyn. Just here." For a moment, all the fear, the doubts, the insecurities she had been carrying for so long seemed to melt away. She had spent years building walls to protect herself, years of loneliness, and yet here he was, willing to stand beside her, unafraid of the things that had held her back. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, but it wasn't a burden. It felt like release, like permission to feel what she had long denied. Evelyn's breath caught as she realized how much she had been craving this, the closeness, the touch, the simple yet profound connection. She didn't have to fight it any longer. With a trembling hand, she reached out and placed it gently over his, their fingers entwining for the first time. "I don't know what this means," she whispered, her voice fragile but sure. "But I want to find out." Alex didn't hesitate. He leaned in then, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was soft at first, as if testing the waters. But as the kiss deepened, Evelyn felt her heart open in ways she hadn't thought possible. She could taste the sweetness of the wine on his lips, feel the warmth of his skin against hers. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was tender, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had shared. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads touched, both of them breathing heavily. There were no words for what had just passed between them, no need for explanations. In that moment, All that mattered was that they had crossed a threshold together. And neither of them looked back. The days after that night felt like a dream. A beautiful, quiet reverie that Evelyn couldn't quite wake from. She found herself thinking about Alex constantly, remembering the way his touch had felt, the weight of his gaze, and how everything about that evening had been different. But it wasn't just the physicality of it that stayed with her. It was the realization that love, in all its complexity, could bloom at any age and any form. There was no guidebook for this kind of relationship, no well-worn path to follow. She had spent so many years defining herself by what society expected from someone her age, by what others might think of her if they knew. But now, with Alex, none of that seemed to matter. Evelyn found herself walking through her days with a renewed sense of freedom. The humdrum of her life had been replaced by anticipation. Small moments of happiness that now filled the spaces she had once thought were permanently empty. She thought about the things that had held her back for so long. The idea that love was reserved for the young, the notion that her age would make her a target for ridicule or judgment. How foolish she had been, believing that time could define her worth. Alex had taught her that love wasn't something bound by numbers or expectations. It was about the connection, the chemistry, the willingness to be vulnerable, to truly see one another. She still feared the judgment of others, of course, the whispers behind closed doors, the looks she might get if people knew the truth. But the more she spent with Alex, the more she realized that it wasn't about them. It wasn't about what anyone else thought. Evelyn had spent so many years hiding pieces of herself, building walls around her heart to protect it from disappointment, from loss. But Alex, his warmth, his laughter, the way he saw her as something more than a relic of a past life, had torn down those walls piece by piece. In the stillness of her thoughts, Evelyn began to see herself differently. She wasn't just the sum of the years she had lived or the roles she had played. She was someone capable of love, of desire, of feeling something as deep and as wild as what Alex had awakened in her. She looked in the mirror one morning and smiled. There was no gray hair hiding her years, no lines that whispered of time's passage, but she didn't mind. The woman in the reflection was stronger, fuller, more aware of herself than she had ever been before. She loved without fear now, or at least without as much fear. Love had shown her a new side of herself, a side that wasn't constrained by anything but her own desires. And she had come to understand that age, like any other obstacle, was just a number. It couldn't define the depth of her feelings, the richness of her experiences. As she sat in her living room one afternoon, waiting for Alex to arrive, Evelyn reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. What had once seemed like an impossible thing, this connection, this love had become her reality. And though she knew there were challenges ahead, Evelyn felt ready to face them. She was no longer the woman who lived in fear of age or judgment. She was a woman in love, and that was more than enough. As she heard the sound of Alex's car pulling into the driveway, Evelyn stood up, her heart quickening. This was her life now. This was the love she had been waiting for, in a form she had never expected but had always needed. And for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace with herself when Alex walked through the door. His smile was the same as it had been that first day, warm, easy, full of life. Yet for Evelyn, it held a depth now that it hadn't before. There was a story between them that only they knew, a shared understanding that transcended any external judgment or societal norm. And that was enough. As they settled into their routine, something remarkable happened. It wasn't the grand gestures or the whispered promises of forever. It was the simplicity of it all. The moments they shared, the quiet mornings, the laughter over lunch, the conversations that stretched late into the night, became the foundation of something real, something grounded in the truth of who they were. They had found each other in the unlikeliest of places, at the intersection of age, time, and circumstance, where the heart knew what it wanted before the mind could catch up. For Evelyn, this journey wasn't just about love. It was about reclaiming parts of herself that she had buried under years of convention. It was about choosing to live fully, to embrace the unknown, and to love without apology. In Alex's arms, she had rediscovered a part of her she thought was lost to time, her sense of joy, of possibility, of being seen for who she truly was, beyond her years. She had once thought that love, the kind that made your heart race, was something reserved for the young. But now, she understood that love was a living thing, ever evolving, untamed by the passage of time. It could happen at any stage of life, in any form, with anyone, and it was beautiful. Evelyn learned that love had no expiration date. It was not a fleeting thing that could be marked by the years. No, it was something deeper, something far more enduring. It was the connection between two people who chose each other every day, in the quiet moments and the loud ones, in the vulnerability and the strength. In her quiet moments of reflection, Evelyn often thought about the journey she had been on, how it had shaped her, how it had made her stronger. She thought about the woman she had become, someone who had embraced love at its most unexpected, its most tender. And she thought about the future, which no longer seemed daunting or distant. She had found someone who saw her, who cherished her, who didn't care about age or labels or the judgments of others. As she lay beside Alex one evening, the sound of his heartbeat steady against her ear, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had walked through so many years of uncertainty, of doubt, and now, in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. Whatever comes, she whispered to herself, I will follow my heart. No matter the obstacles, no matter the age. And with that, Evelyn closed her eyes, a smile playing on her lips, knowing that love in all its forms was the greatest gift she could ever give herself. It was timeless, it was hers, and it was enough.